The first man who mocked her cabin wouldn't survive to see spring. His name had been Jed Packer, and he'd boasted of felling 12 pines in a single day to frame his 2-room log house. He'd raised the walls tall, left wide window gaps for cross-draft ventilation, and even fashioned a loft he never quite finished. He called her place a mole hole, spat those words out loud to a crowd gathered outside the trading post before winter's first frost. "She's burying herself like a badger," he laughed. "What kind of woman seals her home in dirt?" No one had an answer then. They were too busy chuckling, nodding, slapping their knees. But by February, Jed's windows had frozen over from the inside, his firewood soaked through, and the howling wind found its way through every chink in his walls. By March he was dead in his bed, curled in a coat that still had ice on the inside. And the woman in the earth-wrapped cabin never once came to ask for help. Her name was Elsie Walker, 35, widowed in childbirth, mother of none. She hadn't always been the strange one, not until she started digging into the hillside like she meant to vanish in it. It was the fall of 1867 when she arrived, just ahead of the hard freeze that'd go on to kill 7 more men before winter's end. She had 1 mule, a broken wagon, and no visible tools beyond a dented shovel and a sack of nails that spilled in the dirt. Her dress was the sort that looked better suited for tending graves than planting crops. Black as coal, tight at the wrist, stiff at the shoulders. But it wasn't grief that weighed her down, not anymore. The grave she'd stood over in Kansas was long behind her. Now she was hunting for warmth, and the truth was she didn't believe in chimneys anymore. The land she picked sat low along the bluff, where a shallow creek forked into cottonwood roots and disappeared into reeds. The town of Warren's Hollow had only been around 4 winters by then, and none of the men had built this close to the hill. Too soft, they said, too prone to flooding. "You'll sink before you freeze," one man told her as she began to dig. But she didn't answer. She just kept carving her home into the earth like the hillside had betrayed her, and she meant to punish it. And when she built down. She dug until her arms trembled, her fingernails split, and mud clung to the hem of her skirt like a second skin. A few children came to watch her in the evenings, whispering behind cedar trunks that the widow had gone cave crazy. They watched her reinforce the low ceiling with flat-cut timbers, some scavenged from the abandoned mine a few miles west. She used stone for the rear wall, packed mud for insulation, and laid sod and earth back atop the roof so that by late October you couldn't tell there was a cabin there at all, just a dark square of earth with a door sunk into it, like a grave with a handle, and Lord help them all, she sealed the chimney shut. That was the part that made the men furious. "You want to kill yourself? Do it in private," barked Luther Kane, the same man who'd tried to sell her stovepipe that first week. "But don't go showing the children that a home with no flue can be lived in. You'll give 'em foolish ideas." The truth, her stove wasn't like theirs. Elsie had dragged it in herself, an iron beast of a thing built squat and wide, something likely meant for a ship galley. It vented into a buried channel, a trench she'd lined with flat stones and run out the back of the cabin, well underground. She called it her earth lung, said the heat that traveled through it lingered longer, breathed slower. No one believed her, not then. They laughed behind her back, said she was playing at mole witch engineering. But her firewood stayed dry, and her breath didn't show in the mornings. By mid-December, the men began to notice small things. Their boots still frozen by dawn, their cabin corners lined with frost. Meanwhile, smoke never once rose from Elsie's place. No one saw her gather wood, and yet her lanterns glowed all night. There were whispers. Some said she was a witch. Others said she was stealing heat from the old mine shafts, draining the hill itself. One child swore she'd seen her crawl out of the ground before sunup, wearing gloves that steamed in the cold. Her eyes, the girl claimed, glowed like the stove was still inside her. But the truth was colder and simpler. Elsie just didn't trust the wind. She knew what it could do. Her first husband had died with his lungs full of snow after the flue failed in their cabin outside Wichita. A downdraft blew ash into his eyes, blinded him long enough to stumble back into the stove and split his skull. The baby was born blue 2 weeks later. Elsie buried them both that winter and stopped trusting holes in walls that promised warmth but invited cold. So in Warren's Hollow, she built heat like a secret, buried it, banked it, coiled it like a snake under stones. By January, the first man came knocking. Not Jed. Jed was still pretending the frost on his window was just a trick of the dew. No, it was young Nathan Bell, barely 21 and already coughing blood. He knocked twice, hat in hand, and begged only for advice. "How'd you keep the frost off your boots?" he asked, lips blue. She didn't answer right away, just studied him, the way his skin cracked at the knuckles, the way his coat didn't fit right. Then she gave him one word: dirt. He didn't understand, so she opened the door just enough to show him the wall behind it. Not logs, not canvas, but thick packed soil, curved inward like a cave, laced with roots that twitched when the wind howled above. He went away shaking, told the others she was mad, but 2 nights later, his brother came. By early February, a quiet line of men had begun walking down to her hillside in the dark, not to beg shelter, but to ask how. She turned them all away. "I built this for me," she said once, voice muffled by the thick wool curtain she kept over the door. "And the ones who laughed loudest can freeze loudest too." That week, Jed Packer died, and then the winds came worse. They screamed down the pass like wolves, driving snow through every chink not stuffed with rag or hay. Chimneys rattled, fires died, roofs groaned under the weight of wet drifts. The men tried everything. They burned chairs, tore up floorboards, wrapped their babies in bark, but it wasn't enough. And in the darkest nights, when the wind carried no sound but its own, they swore they could hear the faint hum of warmth beneath the widow's home, a breath of heat that never once escaped into the sky. By March, Elsie stepped outside for the first time in weeks. Her cheeks were pink, her boots dry. The first man to see her dropped his axe in the snow. She nodded once, didn't smile, just turned to her woodpile. Not a stick missing. She'd made it through winter without splitting a single log in the open air. But the thaw brought more than admiration. It brought envy. And envy, in a place like Warren's Hollow, didn't just melt with the snow. The first thaw didn't bring relief. It brought reckoning. When the snow began to sag under its own weight, and rivulets of meltwater ran down from the hills in quiet trickles, the men of Warren's Hollow stepped out of their frost-bitten cabins, with eyes sunken and shoulders bent, like soldiers emerging from a siege. Their homes stank of smoke, mold, and rot. A few still had embers in the hearths, but most had gone dark. Blankets hung in doorways. Floors were damp. Rats had chewed through crates in search of warmth or food. And yet there stood Elsie Walker's door, flush to the hillside, dry as the moment she sealed it months before. No sagging roof, no cracked timber, just a clean-cut square of wood embedded in the mud wall, with a small rock placed beside it, a stone smoothed by water, round and pale. It was a marker, not of welcome, but of boundary. The men understood that much. Those who had come in desperation now returned out of wounded pride, and something else they wouldn't say aloud: fear. Because by now, stories had spread. Tom Burnett, the Smiths' oldest boy, had said he saw her walking barefoot outside her cabin one dawn, pressing her feet into the snow like it was summer dirt. Mabel Hunt, one of the seamstresses, swore she'd seen smoke coming up from the ground behind the widow's home, not from a chimney, but the soil itself. "Like the earth was breathing warm through her stove," she whispered, and one child, little Clara Jenkins, claimed to have slept one night outside the widow's door after getting lost in a storm. She'd curled up beside that earth wall, sobbing, frost clinging to her lashes, and she told her father that the ground behind her hummed like a mother's voice. Clara had survived the night with no frostbite, no cough, not even a sniffle. Her father never reported it. He just put up extra logs around their cabin's base the next day, began to shovel dirt against the corners, and so it began, the imitation. At first it was small. Men packed snow against the outsides of their homes, then dirt when it melted, trying to thicken the walls, seal the gaps, create something like insulation. But they didn't understand the principle. They blocked their chimneys, only to smoke themselves near to death. They pressed damp soil against pine without barrier layers, and the walls began to mildew. One man buried half his firewood beneath his cabin, thinking it would stay dry, and it bloomed into mold within a week. They were trying to copy something they didn't understand, because they still believed warmth came from fire. Elsie Walker knew better. Inside her earth-wrapped cabin, she didn't just survive, she lived. The floor was dry. The walls held a gentle warmth that radiated from the buried heat channels, coiled beneath like a sleeping beast. She'd lined the ceiling with oilskin, backed it with sheep's wool, and above that the weight of earth, kept in every ember of heat. The stove didn't roar, it purred. She fed it little, but let it live always, like a heartbeat. And she did it alone. No man had set foot past that door, not since the day she built it. But now they came not in desperation, but curiosity. The first was Caleb Myrick, the town's self-proclaimed builder. He'd overseen 5 of the cabins in Warren's Hollow, declared himself a kind of informal foreman back when the town was still just stakes and tents. He came with a lantern in one hand and a crude drawing in the other. "I come to offer a trade," he said through the curtain over her door. "Blueprints, or what passes for 'em." Elsie opened the door only part way. "Trade for what?" "Just a look," he said. "Let me see the inside, that's all." She stared at him, at his cracked lips, the way his lantern hand trembled not from cold but weakness. "No one gets to see," she said. "That's what makes it work." He frowned, confused. "Makes what work?" "The warmth," she said, and shut the door. Later that week, Mirik tried to dig his own trench system behind his cabin, but he dug too shallow, too wide. Meltwater filled the channels. He caught pneumonia, died a month later, and still the widow's earth-breathing home glowed each night like an ember buried in the hillside. But she didn't rest easy, because something had changed in town. At first, it was the looks, averted eyes when she came to the well, quiet when she passed through the trading post, an odd silence that settled when her footsteps approached. She didn't need much, a little flour, salt, sometimes lye. She paid without barter, never asked favors, never lingered. But now men moved aside for her not out of respect, but suspicion. Because when a woman survives what the rest of them barely endured and thrives, she becomes something else, a symbol, and symbols are dangerous. One night a rock was thrown against her door, not enough to break it, but enough to startle. Another night a bundle of sage was burned outside her cabin, its smoke pungent, acrid, the work of superstition. A message. They didn't understand her, so they named her wrong. Witch, mole woman, widow builder, dirt wife. The names came like thorns on whispers, and then someone cut her vent. The rear heat channel, the stone-lined tunnel that ran beneath her cabin, was blocked, not by accident. Someone had shoveled dirt down the far end, sealed it tight. The stove wouldn't draw. The heat began to suffocate inside the walls. Elsie caught it quick, smelled the backflow in her sleep, and scrambled out before the smoke choked her. It was a warning, or worse, a trial, to see if she could be broken. She rebuilt the vent in 2 days, dug it deeper, shifted it lower, curved it tighter. No one saw her work. She moved like the mole they mocked her as, unseen, silent, steady. And when she re-emerged, she planted something outside her door. A row of small stones, 6 of them, smooth, aligned, one for each man who'd come asking for her secrets. By now, the town was watching too close to pretend anymore. Mothers wrapped their children tighter. Men whispered about what she might be, and a meeting was called, unofficial but serious, in the back of the trading post. They didn't talk of banishing her, not outright, but there were suggestions. Maybe she should move. Maybe her kind of building didn't fit in Warren's Hollow. Maybe she drew wolves. Maybe she'd made a deal with the mountain. The words were vague, but the intent wasn't. Only one person stood for her, Mabel Hunt. "She ain't hurt no one," Mabel said, arms crossed tight. "She didn't throw a single insult when you all called her mad. She didn't take your food, didn't steal your wood. She just lived, and that's more than most of you managed." But Mabel's words didn't cool the room. They made it boil. Because the men in that room weren't mad at Elsie Walker for surviving. They were mad because she'd done it without them, without asking, without bending, without breaking, without dying, and that made her dangerous. So they made a decision. One night in early April, a group of 3 men, faces wrapped, boots mud-caked, crept to the back of Elsie's hillside. They carried shovels and rope, not to kill her, just to bury the vent again. A message, one she'd find hard to undo. But she was waiting. The earth beside the vent cracked open like a mouth, and Elsie rose from it. Not like a ghost, not like a witch, but like a woman who knew exactly what they were doing and why. She held no lantern, just a shovel. No words passed, only the sudden hush of wind and the sound of boots retreating down the slope. When morning came, they found new stones outside her door, 3 of them, fresh, clean, warm to the touch, as if they'd been sitting near the stove all night. The message was clear, she knew, and she would not be moved. By late spring the thaw revealed what the freeze had hidden, the bones of the cabins that hadn't lasted, the rot beneath the floorboards, the damage the men refused to admit. But one home stood untouched, the earth-wrapped cabin, and inside, Elsie Walker stoked a fire that never once betrayed her. The valley turned green while the widows stayed quiet. April's thaw seeped into May's bloom, and still no one had seen inside Elsie Walker's home. The sod above her roof sprouted wildflowers. The patchwork roots binding her ceiling held firm even as the rains came in sudden, blinding sheets. While other cabins took in water through their rotted seams, Elsie's stayed hidden, humming beneath the hillside like a lung asleep. And yet it wasn't admiration she earned from the men, it was humiliation. Warren's Hollow was not a town built on humility. It was built by men who'd swung axes into pine trunks and declared themselves kings of dirt. Men who fought the soil for every bean sprout, who bled into the floorboards they laid down with bare hands. To admit a widow had built better, without their help, without their approval, was a wound they couldn't cauterize, so instead of learning they denied. She cheated, they told themselves. Some trick of the earth, some accident. It won't last another winter. And they began building again, but not smarter, just angrier. They raised their walls higher, broader. They lined them with bark, then tar, then wool. They hauled stones not for heat but for defense. Thick masonry fireplaces meant to burn hotter, longer, with new chimneys raised high to catch every wind. But the cost was heat lost. The cabins vented like kettles in the storm. The warmth fled upward, and already as summer crept in, the men whispered of plans to rebuild again. Add trapdoors, bury barrels of coals, design vents based on rumors of what the widow had done. None had the courage to ask her outright, except one. Her name was Ruth Barrett. She was new to the valley, arrived with the snowmelt, pregnant and alone, a widow herself by every indication, though she never said so in words. Her wagon was barely intact, a skeleton of canvas and rusted bolts. She'd traded 2 quilts for a spade and a second-hand hatchet, and she'd begun to dig into the hillside 5 ridges over from Elsie. Not as deep, not as steady, but enough that the men took notice. She's trying to copy her, they muttered. But Ruth didn't care. She watched the way the sunlight struck the hill come morning. She pressed her ear to the dirt to hear how the ground held its cold long into the day. She angled her fire pit low and rearward. She carved a vent tunnel on instinct alone, curved it against the slope, roofed it with flat stone, and sealed it with clay. And on the 4th day, she came to the widow's cabin, not begging, not barging. She just stood by the stone marker, the original one, and waited. Elsie opened the door without a word, and for a long minute, neither spoke. Finally, Ruth said, "I ain't asking to come in. I just want to know if I'm doing it wrong." Elsie stared, then stepped out, closed the door behind her, and began walking. She didn't look back to see if Ruth followed, but Ruth did. The 2 women walked in silence over the ridges, under the cottonwoods, past the remnants of frost-bitten cabins whose owners had long since fled or failed. And when they came to Ruth's half-dug hollow, Elsie paused. She walked the perimeter, pressed her palm to the wall, smelled the clay near the stove vent, kicked the dirt above the fire channel, and tasted the air, then said simply, "You're close." Ruth's shoulders sagged in relief. "What am I missing?" Elsie gestured to the angle of the hill. "You want the cold to drain out, not settle in. Slope it deeper. Give the heat a spine to climb." Then she stepped back, gaze scanning the horizon. "And dig slow," she said. "Let the dirt learn you." Ruth nodded like a student given sacred instruction, and for the first time in a year, Elsie Walker smiled. It was faint, like a crack in a glacier, but it held warmth. By week's end, the other men had noticed. The 2 widows, digging, shaping, sealing earth, moving with purpose, quiet, alone. And suddenly the valley didn't feel like a kingdom of men anymore. It felt like something older. The women, they began to say, they're changing the land. That summer passed strange. A dry wind rolled in from the west, bleaching the scrub, setting dust into the eyes and mouths of every man who'd left his roof too shallow. The rains came late and hard. Several cabins flooded. One even caved. Luther Kane's second build, the one he'd boasted had walls like fortress thighs. But the widows' homes, dry, warm, still. In late August, a group of children began playing near the ridge. They'd taken to rolling pebbles down the hill, chasing rabbits, and daring each other to touch the stone markers by Elsie's door. One girl, Maisie Bell, sat too long in the grass and grew drowsy. She said it was the hum, said she could feel it through her skirt, a deep warmth from under the dirt, not hot like fire, but steady, comforting. Like when Mama sang before Daddy got sick, she whispered to her teacher. By now, the rumors weren't just rumors, they were belief. Some said the widow had tapped into a ley line. Others said she'd buried fire itself and trained it like a dog. One man swore he saw moss blooming out of season near her rear vent, even in dry heat. Proof, he said, of accursed moisture beneath, but few dared to speak to her directly. Only Ruth, who now brought her a loaf of hard bread once a week, and on days the wind blew fierce, they'd sit in silence beneath the sod roof, just inside Elsie's shallow entry hall, not talking, just breathing warm air and letting the dust pass. Then came the preacher. His name was Elias Granger, sent from the county seat. He wore a coat too fine for the valley and shoes that soaked through within the hour. He was young, stern-eyed, and had a Bible thick with annotations. He preached on sin, shame, and the folly of secrets. And after 2 weeks, he came to Elsie Walker's door. He stood before her stone marker, hat in hand. "You've built a place that defies the Lord's order," he said, voice echoing off the hill. "A home sunk into the earth like a tomb, a fire that does not rise, smoke that does not escape. This is not the way of man." Elsie stood in her doorway, expression unreadable. "I am not a man," she said. Elias stiffened. "And yet you build like one." "No," she said. "I build like earth." He frowned, stepped forward, crossing the marker without hesitation. "The ground is for the dead," he declared, "and you have made your bed in it." Elsie stepped out now, gaze level with his, bare feet silent on the packed clay. "And yet I'm alive," she said, "while your men froze." The preacher's jaw clenched. He turned without a word and walked back down the hill. The next Sunday, he preached a sermon titled Against the Deep. Some listened, others didn't, but winter was coming again, and fear has its own logic. By mid-September, the temperature dropped overnight by 20 degrees. Frost glazed the wells, wood smoke sharpened in the air. And once again, men found their chimneys howling, their children coughing. And once again, Elsie's cabin stayed quiet. But now, she wasn't alone. Ruth's shelter, while not as seamless, held. It was rougher, narrower, but the heat kept. Her belly now round, she sat with hands on her stomach by her stove, whispering to the child inside as frost laced the world outside. And on the first full freeze, she gave birth, alone, in the dirt-wrapped room she'd shaped with her hands. No one heard the cries, no one saw the light. Only Elsie, who came the next morning with broth and a folded wool. She didn't ask to hold the child. She just placed the bowl on the stone shelf near the stove and said, "You built it well." And Ruth, tears drying on her face, said only, "She's warm." It was enough. The valley began to shift then, subtly. Mothers packed dirt around the base of their cabins. Children asked questions they hadn't dared before. And when spring finally came again, no one laughed when Ruth emerged from her hillside with a child on her hip. They didn't speak at all, because somewhere deep inside, they knew the world had changed, and it was not theirs anymore. When the second winter came, it didn't creep, it pounced. The first frost turned to hard ice within hours. Morning dew snapped into brittle crystals before noon. Snow followed by the next dusk, dry and windblown, the kind that didn't pile soft but scoured sideways, stripping bark from trees and stinging cheeks raw. The creek froze solid in 3 days, and the wind didn't howl this time. It shrieked. The men weren't ready, not because they hadn't worked. They had. All summer long, they chopped and stacked wood, laid new insulation, patched roofs, sealed chinks. They even tried earth banking, shoveling dirt up against their cabin walls, burying their foundations knee-high in soil, as though that alone might mimic the widow's secrets. But imitation without understanding only masks weakness. By December, half the valley's cabins were colder inside than the outside windless nights. And Elsie's home, still no smoke, still no cracks, still warm. And now there were 2 of them. Ruth Barrett, now mother to a daughter, Lydia, had proven the thing they feared most, that Elsie Walker's way wasn't a fluke. It could be done again, and not by some mystery woman from a far-off state, but by one of their own, someone who'd built it while pregnant, with no man to lift the heavier stones or plan the air channels. She had done it with her hands, her belly in the way, and her baby in her mind. And that, for some men, was worse than witchcraft. That was proof. A few of the younger wives took note, quietly. No declarations, no breaking of rank, but they began asking questions in ways that sounded harmless. How deep do you think the frost goes in the soil? Is clay better than mud? How would you brace a roof without nails? Where do you hide a fire if you don't want to be found? It wasn't just curiosity, it was survival, because now every family remembered the names of those who hadn't made it through last winter. 7 men, 3 children, 1 entire homestead, the Reddicks, who'd vanished during a snow squall and were only found months later, frozen in their beds, stove burnt out, and roof sagged halfway to the floor. And yet the widow had made it. Not by braving the cold, but by removing herself from its reach. She had not fought winter. She had made it irrelevant. And in a valley that measured its men by how well they endured pain, this was something heretical. That winter was the first time Elsie took in another. Her name was Nora Dilly, widowed, though not by death. Her husband had run off with another woman the spring before, taking their mule and every dry good they owned. Nora had held on through the summer, rebuilt half their roof, traded baked goods for kerosene, and tried to pretend she wasn't unraveling. But when December brought ice that spread across her floors like a disease, she knew she wouldn't make it. And so one night, she walked barefoot to Elsie Walker's cabin. She didn't knock. She just sat down outside the door, wrapped in a quilt, and waited. When Elsie opened the door at dawn, she found Nora asleep, her breath shallow, frost clinging to her lashes, but her cheeks still held color. The earth radiated just enough heat through the ground to hold her above the freeze. Elsie didn't speak. She stepped aside. Let her in. Nora didn't leave again that winter. She took to the quiet easily, like someone who'd already said all her goodbyes. She shared chores, hauling in bundles of dry moss, sewing curtain hems, tending to the root stone that Elsie used to keep vegetables crisp. She asked no questions. Only once did she speak of her old life. "I never knew silence could be kind," she said. Elsie didn't answer. She didn't need to. They understood each other without words. And the stove between them, squat, iron, always glowing, gave no smoke, no roar, just that soft, rhythmic hum. the earth lung drawing breath through stone. But the town had begun to rot, not from cold, but from division. The second winter birthed factions, those who wanted to study the widow's ways, to learn, adapt, survive, and those who wanted to reject it outright, to preserve pride over practicality. They called themselves the Ridge Holders, named for the highest cabins overlooking the valley. They prided themselves on elevation, on tradition, on sun-baked faith in the way it's always been done. Their leader was Jonas Kipp, a former railroad foreman turned trapper. Kipp had come to Warren's Hollow 2 years prior, with a chip on his shoulder and a rifle always leaning against the door. He didn't build his own cabin. He commanded it into being, hiring 2 drifters and a half-sober carpenter to get it done before the first frost. His home was all posture, high roof, wide windows, overhanging eaves, a statement, not a shelter. It had frozen halfway through last winter. He blamed the wood. Now he blamed the widows. "They undermine us," he said at a town meeting held inside the church, breath fogging mid-sermon. "They build like animals. They hide in the dirt. And worst, they teach women that warmth ain't bought with labor but with cowardice." He paused for effect, then added, "We survive because we suffer. That's the law of the frontier." But Ruth had come that day, carried Lydia wrapped in wool, her cheeks red, her baby sleeping warm against her chest. She stood up in the middle of the meeting, waited for silence, then said, quiet but clear, "What law says my child should freeze for your pride?" The room went still. Kip's lips pressed thin. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence was his answer, and hers. She left, walked back through the blowing snow, past men who lowered their eyes, past women who watched with something between fear and wonder. Elsie was waiting at the door when she returned, held it open long enough for Ruth to step through, not as a guest, but as kin. And that night, they didn't speak, didn't need to. 3 women, 1 child, a stove that never went out, and the wind howling beyond packed earth that didn't even tremble. In January, another man died. Old Thomas Bray. He'd tried building a dugout, shallow and unsealed, no insulation, just a hole in the side of the slope, barely timbered, with a canvas flap for a door. He told the others he didn't need help, said he'd learned from the widow, but he hadn't, not really. They found him curled beside his stove, which had asphyxiated in the night. No air channel, no vent, just smoke and silence. The tragedy wasn't in his death. It was in the fact no one was surprised. Kip blamed Elsie. "She killed him with her ideas," he said, but no one echoed him, because the truth had taken root, quiet and slow. Not all dirt is death, and not all fire needs to burn to warm. A 3rd woman came in, February. Hazel Cook. Her husband hadn't died. He'd simply frozen into silence. A man once loud with opinions, now wordless before the cold. Hazel arrived holding their dog, wrapped tight in a shawl, eyes ringed with red. "He wouldn't come," she said at the door. Elsie didn't ask who, just let her in. Now they were 4, and the cabin, that strange dirt-wrapped windowless cave, breathed like a living thing. Heat coiled through the channels. Moisture wicked away through buried stone. The food lasted, the root shelf held, the wool stayed dry, and the wind, no matter how it screamed, never once reached the hearth. And still the town watched. Still the men tried to outdo each other. Thicker walls, more tar, double chimneys. But the more they added, the more they lost. Heat fled up, cold sank in. Their homes were forts, not shelters, built for defiance, not survival. But Elsie's? It was not a war with winter. It was a pact, and it had never been broken, not once. By the time the 3rd winter rolled in, no one laughed anymore. Not at the widow, not at her low-slung roof, or dirt-lined walls, or that strange chimneyless stove. The chuckles had gone quiet, buried beneath too many shallow graves, beneath bitter memories of breath that froze in sleeping mouths, beneath the weight of knowing that she had been right all along. But it was too late to admit it, not out loud, so they lived instead with a different sound, resentment, not shouted from porches or barked in taverns, but carried in glances, exchanged in tight-jawed nods over the butcher's counter, scrawled between the lines of what wasn't said. It was easier to resent her than to change. That year, the snow came early and came often. In October, it arrived like mist, thin and soft. By November, it had turned sharp, and by December, it was a siege. Warren's Hollow became a town trapped in silence. The trails out vanished under drifts. The supply wagons stopped. The forest fell too quiet. Wind clawed against cabins like it was looking for a way in. Families huddled around shrinking wood piles. Mothers whispered fears they hadn't dared say the year before, and babies cried, not for hunger but for warmth. But not in the widow's home. Inside her earth-wrapped cabin, heat moved in secret paths, under stone and wool and careful hands. The stove never roared, it never needed to. Its breath moved like a pulse through the rooms, Slow, steady, warm. The four women had become something more than survivors. They were a pattern, a rhythm. One mended, one stirred, one held the child, one watched the door, and none of them were afraid, not anymore. What terrified the town most was not what happened inside the widow's walls, but what didn't. They didn't cry out for help. They didn't ask for firewood. They didn't barter or beg. They didn't suffer. That was the true heresy, because in Warren's Hollow, suffering was currency. It was what made a man respectable. The more you endured, the more you earned the right to speak. The women had once been part of that calculus, widows of fallen men, mothers of frostbitten children. But now they'd stepped outside it. They had found a way to live without burning through pain. That made them dangerous. By mid-January, a rumor spread that Kip had formed a plan not to evict the widows. Not outright, that would have drawn too much attention, but to expose them, to prove that their way wasn't real, that their warmth came from some secret hoard of coal, or some hidden pipe to the mines, or worse, some unnatural thing. Maybe it's not fire at all, one man whispered in the store. Maybe they got something down there, something. That was all it took. Not a word, a shadow of one. They waited for a night when the wind was loud enough to cover boots in snow. 5 men, faces wrapped, axes and shovels in hand. They didn't mean to hurt anyone, they told themselves. Just uncover the lie, just tear up a section of sod, cut into the wall, find the fire or the secret or the trick. But they hadn't counted on the quiet. Inside the widow's home, every sound was sacred. When you live buried in earth, your ears sharpen. You learn to hear the difference between a bird landing and a fox slipping through grass, between melting snow and a man's breath held too long. Elsie was awake before the first shovel struck dirt. By the time the first sod was lifted, the 4 women were already crouched in the low corridor, backs to stone, breath held. Ruth cradled Lydia. Nora held a knife. Hazel gripped a thick iron pan with both hands. And Elsie? She held nothing. She didn't need to. When the first board cracked under the weight of a boot, she stepped forward and pulled a hidden rope. A shutter dropped. Not wood, not metal, a slab of packed dirt, reinforced with woven roots and flat stone. It fell fast, wedging tight into the corridor behind them. And just like that, the men were in the front chamber, but nowhere else, no deeper. The space they entered was cold, narrow, a decoy, nothing of value, no heat, no food, no fire, just a dry, hollow room with fake stones and empty shelves. A trap, not to catch them, but to confuse them. They struck matches, kicked walls, cursed. "This ain't it," one spat. "Where's the fire?" But the only answer was silence. Then, a sound, a low thud behind them, another slab, not blocking this time, releasing. And with it came a breath of warm air, thick, fragrant, silent. They turned too slow, and in the dark something moved. Not a figure, not a weapon, just a force. The air shifted, a pressure, a silence collapsing into movement. Then light, not firelight, earthlight. Tiny holes punched in the sod roof above released slivers of moonlight. Just enough for them to see what they'd missed. They weren't in her cabin. They were beneath it, buried. They scrambled. 2 men fled before the rest. One slipped on frost and dislocated his shoulder. Another left behind a boot. When they reached the surface again, panting, wide-eyed, they didn't shout, they didn't speak. They just walked home and bolted their doors. The others weren't so lucky. One, they said, stayed inside until dawn, too shaken to move, hands trembling. He said later it felt like the ground had eyes, like he'd been watched, not by the women, but by the house itself. "Like the dirt knew," he whispered. After that night, the town changed. No one visited the ridge anymore, not with questions, not with rumors. They left the widows alone, and quietly, wordlessly, they began to copy them. A young couple, the Stricklands, dug into a low slope 2 hills down. They called it a storm shelter, but they lined it with wool, buried stone, a small vent. The teacher, Miss Evans, added clay between her floorboards and the dirt below, said it just made sense. The butcher sealed a root cellar with sod and lit it with oil lamps at night, lingering longer than necessary. The widow's way, once mocked, now crept like water into cracks, but not openly, never openly. In March, the last of the snow melted. The creek swelled, overflowed, then settled. Crows returned. The air smelled less like iron, more like damp wood, and the widows opened their door. Elsie stood at the threshold, boots dry, sleeves rolled. Lydia, now old enough to toddle, played with a carved wooden sheep at her feet. Behind them, smoke still didn't rise, but warmth did. It radiated from the ground, from their breath, from the silence they wore like a second skin. They didn't speak of what happened that night. The men didn't return. No one confessed. But the absence of accusation was louder than guilt, and everyone knew the truth. They had gone looking for secrets and found only a lesson. You don't conquer the earth. You live with it. That spring, a group of women began gathering near the creek bed, not for gossip, not for worship, to dig. quietly, together. They didn't call it building. They said they were preparing. And when asked by a man what they were preparing for, Ruth turned, smiled, and said, "Whatever winter thinks it can bring next." Spring melted into summer with a kind of uneasy quiet. In Warren's Hollow, nobody quite knew how to talk about the change that had swept through them. It hadn't come with speeches. No guns had fired. No law had shifted, yet something deeper had cracked, something underneath the cabins and behind the fences. A hidden wall, silent and ancient, had begun to collapse, and in its place something older had started to grow. The women were building. They didn't call it that, not openly. They called it clearing land, or drying stone, or leveling ground, but the work was unmistakable. Small trenches appeared along hillsides. Tools vanished from the general store and weren't returned. Layers of clay were left out to dry in the sun, not for pottery, but for wall lining. Fires were dug in the soil, not to cook food, but to harden packed mud. No one said the word cabin out loud, because it wasn't cabins they were making. They were making rooms in the earth, and the earth remembered. Ruth, now with Lydia balanced on her hip, spent most mornings dragging logs down from the tree line, not to build upwards, but sideways. She was adding a second chamber to her slope-dug home, a pantry room, she said, but anyone who'd felt that bitter wind rip through the hollow each winter knew it was more than that. It was a new kind of architecture, one that breathed through dirt and stone instead of chimneys and pitch. Nora began fashioning shutters from salvaged wagon boards, but not for windows. There were none. She used them to block the sloped openings to each cabin's entryway, hinged low so snow wouldn't collect, only slide off. And Hazel, the quietest among them, had begun carving narrow air channels into hollowed reed shafts. She said they let the warm air trickle upward without letting the cold sink in. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was innovation. And innovation, to the old guard of Warren's Hollow, was an insult. Jonas Kipp hadn't left town. He still walked the ridge, still smoked his pipe like a sheriff, and still sat like a coiled spring in the church pews every Sunday. But his voice had dimmed. His followers no longer gathered in numbers, and the glances they threw his way held doubt instead of trust, because deep down, they knew what he refused to say aloud. The women weren't just surviving better, they were thriving. It showed in their faces, in the color on their cheeks, in the calm of their movements. While others still struggled with chimney soot and frost-damp boots, the widows moved like the seasons didn't scare them. And worse still, they moved together. They didn't brag, they didn't challenge, they didn't need to. They just built. The first true storm of the year arrived early, an August squall, wild and wrong. It hit hard, with hail the size of walnut shells and winds that tore the bark from the younger trees. A few cabins lost roof planks. One shed collapsed outright. But the earth-wrapped homes, not a scratch. The water ran off them like a duck's back, the weight of the hill pressing inward with comforting stillness. After the storm, Ruth stepped outside with Lydia wrapped tight on her chest and set a kettle on the flat rock near the rear vent. Steam rose clean. She didn't look toward the other homes. She didn't need to. They saw her, and they understood. By now, the tension in town had changed shape. It was no longer just the men who stood on one side and the widows on the other. The lines blurred. Some families were quietly digging shallow spaces beneath their cabins. Others, too proud, refused to admit they'd copied anything, claiming they'd always planned to build root cellars or storm bunkers. But everyone watched the ridge now, where the four women lived, or more accurately, where the warmth lived. It was no longer a home, it was a center of gravity, and in the dark corners of backroom conversations, some of the men began speaking of it not as a structure, but a threat, not because it burned down cabins, but because it proved those cabins didn't have to be built the way they'd always been. It challenged identity. An identity, when wounded, grows cruel. Kip found his audience again in fear. He called a meeting, not at the church this time, but at the tavern. Beer dulled pride just enough to let shame turn to anger. "They're building something else up there," he growled. "Not just homes. They're laying roots. Changing our women, teaching them they don't need us." One man grunted, another slammed his cup. "What do you propose?" someone asked. Kip didn't say burn it down. He didn't have to. What he said was worse. "We make it ours." The plan was simple. Claim the hill, annex the slope, and the land beneath it under town ordinance. Say the cabins weren't registered, say they were public structures now. Send men to inspect, start charging taxes on the improvements. And if the women refused, well then, the town would decide who stayed and who left. Elsie heard about it before they arrived, not from a child or a whisper, but from Mabel Hunt, the seamstress, who had quietly chosen her side. "They'll come by week's end," Mabel said, standing at the edge of the widow's ridge with wind in her hair and worry in her eyes. "They say it's legal, that your homes are town property if they're unclaimed." Elsie only nodded. "I don't keep papers," she said. Mabel sighed. "I know. They'll come regardless. Yes, Elsie turned back toward her cabin. Let them see what they want. When the men came, they didn't come with torches. They came with ledgers, 3 of them, clipboard, ink, boots polished for the illusion of authority. One was the mayor's cousin. Another was a failed teacher turned self-appointed clerk. The third was Jonas Kipp. They didn't knock. They called, "Elsie Walker, we're here under town authority to assess unclaimed property." No answer, just the steady moan of wind across the ridge. They stepped closer. Kip's boots sank slightly into the earth above the buried vent tunnel. He frowned, motioned to the others. Check the interior, but there was no door, not anymore, only the stone marker, and beside it 3 smaller ones, freshly placed. Kip bent down, ran his fingers along the top. They were warm, not from sun, from within. "What is this?" the clerk muttered. Kip stood, unsettled. Then the earth made a sound. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a shift, a movement too small to be seen, too large to be natural, a breath, a heartbeat. The slope beneath them settled, just slightly, as though the ridge were repositioning itself. Kip stumbled. The other 2 backed away. They didn't speak again. Not then, not when they returned to town, not when the mayor asked for an update. All they said was, "No one home." No one ever went back. That winter came without warning. The first freeze hit before October ended, and the town was caught half-prepared. Snow came early, ice stayed longer, and for the first time in living memory, the river didn't thaw once that December. Food ran low, fires burned out, and through it all, the widows stayed warm. But they didn't stay silent. This time, they opened their doors, not to all, but to those who asked without shame. A mother with a newborn, a boy with burnt hands, an old trapper with frostbitten toes. One by one they knocked, one by one they entered, and when they left they didn't talk about what they saw inside, because they couldn't describe it, not accurately. How do you explain a warmth that doesn't come from fire, a silence that comforts instead of unnerves, a shelter not built but grown, and more than anything, how do you describe a home that holds you like a mother's arms? By spring, Warren's Hollow was changed forever. Some homes stood, some didn't, some families stayed, some left, but the ridge remained, unburned, unbroken, unbowed, and at its center the earth-wrapped cabin no longer stood alone. It stood among a cluster of quiet homes, half-buried, barely visible, breathing in winter, breathing out warmth. By the 4th year, Warren's Hollow was no longer a town built on lumber. It was a town built on memory, and memory is slow to change, but impossible to ignore. The land remembered who lived and who didn't. The wind knew which roofs stayed on, and the soil carried the quiet truth of who had outlasted the frost, not by might, but by humility. People stopped calling the ridge Elsie's place. That name didn't fit anymore. It wasn't just her home. It had become something larger, more layered, a woven gathering of chambers and paths, small gardens grown along slope edges, moss-covered vents shaped like stone mouths. Some cabins were new, others had been there for seasons now. A few were still only half carved into the earth. Slow work in a world where the pace of survival had grown deliberate. Locals just called it the Roots, not a name meant to diminish it, but one that revealed its nature, because it no longer looked like any other place in the valley. From a distance, there were no peaks, no smoking chimneys, no walls, just soft mounds like ancient burials, scattered with river stones, a quiet patchwork of green on the hillside. But beneath, there was life. It wasn't a commune. There were no meetings, no chants, no flags. No one ever joined the Roots. People came when they were tired of shivering, when they were tired of waiting for someone to save them, when they were ready to give up the shape of a house in order to remember the function of a home. And inside those cabins, the silence was different. Not emptiness, not gloom, but containment. The kind of hush that holds in warmth, that listens before it speaks, that wraps you before you realize you're cold. Elsie had not asked for followers. She hadn't even asked for company, but now she moved through the Roots, not alone, but like a matriarch, not a leader, not a mother, something else, something steadier. Children began to play between the sod mounds. They ran along the gentle slopes, sliding in summer dust, rolling in fall leaves, their laughter echoing like birdsong across packed clay. They wore wool, carried dried apples in pockets. Their cheeks glowed in winter like they'd never known the taste of smoke in their lungs. And Ruth's daughter Lydia, now almost 4, was one of the loudest among them. She'd never lived in a cabin with sharp corners, never slept beneath a creaking roof, never felt her breath fog from cold. To her, the world had always been quiet and warm and humming. To her, this was normal, and that frightened some in town more than any blizzard ever could. Because it meant this way of life might last, might spread, and spread it did, first slowly, then all at once. A young couple named Harlan and Josie dug into the far west ridge, using tips they claimed they'd heard from books, but everyone knew the truth. Their home held through a frost so deep it cracked 3 chimneys in the town's south quarter. Then the gravedigger, Samuel Beck, began sleeping in a dirt chamber he hollowed beside his shed. Said the cold couldn't follow him underground. After that, even the schoolteacher started insulating the classroom floor with clay. What had begun as a rebellion became the new norm, and in that shift, power changed hands. The old voices, the ones that had laughed, grew quieter. They weren't chased out, they weren't punished, they were simply left behind. Jonas Kipp was the last holdout, still loud, still pacing the tavern porch with his rifle slung low, still complaining about rat holes in the dirt. But nobody asked him to lead anymore. Nobody echoed his jokes. When his roof caved during a March thaw, no one offered help. He rebuilt alone, and no one saw smoke from his cabin again. But this story isn't about him. It's about what happens when you give warmth a place to live, and how it grows. Elsie no longer slept in the same chamber she once built. That room had become a kind of gathering place now, used for meals, for sewing, for quiet talk during storms. Her personal space was farther back, lower down. Ruth had carved it herself as a gift. It stayed warm even in the dead of February. Nora had taken to keeping records, scratched into flattened bark with burnt tips. Not journals exactly, more like memory maps. When a vent was dug, how many layers of moss lined a chamber, which angle the rain flowed off each hill. She wasn't a scholar, but her work felt like scripture. Practical, reverent, real. Hazel kept the animals. 2 goats, 6 hens, 1 nearly blind dog who'd wandered in and never left. She spoke little, but her hands moved with grace, and when snow buried the valley again, it was her oil-pressed eggs and milk that kept the children full. They didn't take newcomers easily. You had to be ready to listen. You had to leave pride at the edge of the hill. But when you came humbly, frostbitten, or with your baby in arms, or simply too tired to chop one more splintered log, there was always a place for you. They didn't call it charity. They called it common sense, because survival, they believed, wasn't about toughness. It was about design. And winter was no longer the enemy, it was a teacher. By the 5th freeze, the town held its breath. Another storm came, worse than any before. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in 2 nights. The wind came not in gusts, but in a solid wall, flattening fences, tearing tarps, splintering roofs like rotted bark. It howled like it remembered every house that had once mocked the ridge and now dared stand in defiance. Lights flickered, chimneys cracked, and one by one, townsfolk trudged up the hill. They came with nothing, just boots, children, thin coats. Some carried nothing at all but the memory of old laughter and a prayer they'd be forgiven. Elsie opened the door. The others didn't even need to ask. No judgment, no speeches, just warmth, just food, just hands. That night, 26 souls slept beneath the ridge. They slept under sod and moss and carved earth. They slept in heat that never escaped, in silence that didn't smother but cradled, and for the first time in their lives, many of them woke not from cold, but because they had slept too well. In the morning, Ruth brewed tea from dried mint and served it in clay bowls. Hazel passed out wool scraps to wrap hands. Nora handed out bark slates to keep count. Who had come, what they'd brought, what they might trade when the snow melted. Elsie said nothing. She just sat near the stove, eyes half closed, feeling the breath of warmth against her knees. That day, someone from town, no one remembered who, whispered that word again. Witch, but no one echoed it. Not this time, because they all knew the truth. If she was a witch, then thank God for witches. If she was unnatural, then nature had failed them. If she was wrong, then why did her home feel more right than anything they'd ever known? And so, the roots grew. Not just the homes, but the idea that shelter wasn't a thing you fought to defend. It was a thing you invited others into, not because you were weak, but because you were wise. And winter would keep trying, but it would never win again, not while the earth remembered, and the warmth stayed buried. The 6th winter came without prelude. There were no warning clouds, no uneasy silence from the animals, no crackling shift in the air that folks swore they could sense before a freeze. It arrived in one violent sweep. Rain turned to sleet before noon, sleet to snow before dusk, and by the time the church bell rang to mark the hour, the wind was screaming. It hit so fast that half the valley didn't even have time to prepare. Firewood left out soaked through. 2 new families that had moved in during summer, young, hopeful, eager to build the old-fashioned way, lost their rooftops in the first 12 hours. A boy trying to fetch water from the river lost 2 fingers to frostbite. His mother walked him to the roots, stumbling the last mile through thigh-deep snow. Ruth opened the door before she knocked. The roots no longer waited to be asked. They watched. There was no formal rule. No one had carved laws into the ridge. But some things didn't need law. The same way smoke rises from fire, or frost clings to the edges of a window, there was now a kind of gravity to the place. It pulled people toward it, people who didn't want to conquer the winter anymore, only to survive it without losing themselves. That year, over 40 people slept in earth homes. They weren't all in Elsie's original cabin. That chamber was still the heart, the firestone, but new branches had been dug out, narrow tunnels leading to sleeping alcoves, storage spaces, kitchens, even a schoolroom that could hold 15 if they sat close. The design had changed with each passing year, each winter revealing some flaw, some lesson. One chamber had failed 2 years prior when heavy rains caused a wall to buckle. Hazel had rebuilt it with roots braided from stripped willow bark, laced between packed clay and buried stone like a woven net. It hadn't shifted since. Another tunnel had grown stale with too many people breathing and no exit flow. Nora solved it by crafting a sloped air duct through layers of moss, which wickeded moisture and pulled air slowly upward without ever letting cold sink in. The system had been copied 6 times since then. These weren't just homes now. They were knowledge, living memory, packed in mud and straw, shaped by hands who learned by failing and tried again without shame. Elsie had grown older. Her hair was white now, though few had noticed when the shift came. Her movements were slower but never frail. She still walked the chambers with bare feet, even in January. Her soles hardened to the cold dirt floor, her eyes always focused just ahead. She'd become a kind of center, not a leader, not in the way the old town had defined it, but a shape around which others arranged themselves. She listened more than she spoke. She watched how the children pressed their ears to the walls and giggled at the warmth. She touched the moss when it started to smell of rot and said, "Too much moisture. Shift the vent." She didn't command, she observed, and when she made a decision, no one questioned it, because she had earned that silence. The snow didn't stop for 12 days. 12. The town, what remained of it, was paralyzed. Fences vanished, footpaths disappeared, chimneys were buried. One cabin near the northern bend collapsed entirely when the drifting snow formed a 5-foot crest above its roof. The family had already left by then, carried by sleigh to the roots, teeth chattering, clothes soaked. They were given a chamber that had been carved just weeks earlier by 2 teenage boys. Their first build, too narrow in places but dry, warm. The newcomers wept when they realized the floor held no frost. One of the children curled up beside the wall and refused to leave it for hours. No one mocked them. In the roots, there were no stories about how tough your winter had been, only that you had endured, only that you had come in from the wind. On the 6th day of snow, Ruth stepped outside for the first time. The sky was grey, not the flat dull of December, but the thick leaden tone that makes you feel like the heavens are pushing down. She wore a heavy wrap of wool and fox fur, her boots laced tight, and stood on the ridge looking out across what used to be Warren's Hollow. What she saw wasn't the same town. It was a ghost map, cabins buried to their windows, smoke only from a few chimneys, no movement on the trails, except one, a single figure, walking stiff through the drifts, bundled but thin, each step breaking crusted snow. Ruth recognized him before she even saw the face. Jonas Kipp. He was older now, leaner, grayer, his fire worn down to cinders. He carried no pack, just a walking stick and a hand wrapped in cloth. Even from this distance, she could tell something had broken in him. She didn't move, didn't wave, just stood and watched him climb the ridge, slow, panting, step by step. When he reached her, he stopped, said nothing. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Kip looked down toward the hidden homes, the smokeless warmth, the lives below ground that had outlasted him. His voice cracked. I was wrong." Ruth didn't answer. She just looked at him. His lips trembled. "Is there a place for me?" It wasn't a question. It was surrender. Ruth turned and led him in. The other women said nothing when he entered. Hazel gave him broth. Nora wrapped his feet in boiled wool. Elsie didn't speak until he had finished eating. When she did, her voice was calm. "You don't need forgiveness to be warm," she said, "just stillness." Kip wept. It was the only time any of them had seen him bend. That night he slept beneath a sod ceiling in a bed carved into clay. He never left again, took to hauling firewood for others, never spoke in meetings, just listened. The roots didn't need converts, they needed hands. Winter finally broke in late March. The thaw came slow. the creek pushing up through its frozen crust, the soil softening in patches. Green returned, and with it, visitors, not from town, from elsewhere. A trader passed through, said he'd heard stories south of the ridge, stories of buried homes that stayed warm through any cold, of quiet women who built the wind out, of heat that moved like a secret, and homes without roofs that still breathed. He asked to see one. Elsie let him in. He stayed a day, asked no questions, took notes on nothing. But when he left, he said this: "You've built something older than timber, something older than fire." And she nodded. "We just remembered what the land already knew." He rode off, slow, and in his silence, a new rumor began. Other towns would hear, some would scoff, some would copy, but none would laugh, not anymore, because the warmth that lived in the ridge now had witnesses, and witnesses carry truth farther than walls ever could. The seventh winter never really ended. The thaw came late, the melt was slow, and even when the trees bloomed and the creek swelled back into itself, the cold still lingered, not as frost, but as a memory etched into the bones of everyone who'd lived through the snow that wouldn't stop. It was a year folks began calling the Long White. But in the roots, the cold had become familiar, not welcomed but understood. It didn't bring terror anymore. It brought work, inventory, reinforcement, candles made, wool washed, clay stomped flat, food cured and tucked away. Nothing rushed, but nothing left undone. That spring, people from beyond the valley began arriving, not just with hunger, but with questions. How do you make the vents curve without drawing smoke back inside? How deep should we dig before the frost line? What's your soil made of? Does it hold through rain? The traders, the drifters, the scouts from far-off settlements, they came with open eyes, cracked hands, and a kind of hopeful shame. They came from towns where children had died of cold in their beds. From places where 6 men froze together in a loft because they refused to huddle like women. From places where pride had been the last thing to thaw. They came not looking to own the knowledge, they came hoping to be forgiven by it. And the roots didn't turn them away, not if they came ready to listen. By now, Elsie had become something almost mythic. She didn't move like a leader, didn't dress like one, didn't even speak like one. But when she entered a room, others stopped talking. When she stood outside in the wind and squinted at a vent's angle, the builder adjusted it without needing a word. They had learned that rightness wasn't always loud, that sometimes truth just held. She was slowing though. Everyone saw it. Her walks took longer, her voice cracked more, her breath came short when the work grew heavy. But she never let go of the rhythm, never stepped away, until the night her legs gave out. It was Ruth who found her, not collapsed, not unconscious, just sitting in the moss corridor, leaning back against the earth wall, eyes half closed. "I'm not cold," Elsie said softly. "I know," Ruth replied, kneeling beside her. "You never are." Elsie smiled. It was small, and it stayed. "There's something I want you to build." Ruth didn't hesitate. "Tell me." Elsie's hand touched the clay beside her. "A chamber, one deep, one that holds still air. For you, for memory." That night the women gathered, not to grieve but to build, to prepare. They dug slow, careful, not mourning, not yet, only listening. The way Elsie had taught them, the soil would speak. It always did. If you pressed your ear to the ground and held your breath long enough, it would tell you where it wanted to hold weight, where it could cradle warmth, where it could become a room, not a grave. And when they were done, they shaped it like a heart, not a valentine, but the real kind. Chambers and folds, a vent like a slow artery, a place not of display, but of function. Elsie slept in that chamber her final winter. She didn't ask for visitors, but children crept in quietly. Some curled at her feet and whispered stories. Others left dried flowers. A few sat beside her in silence, watching the flicker of the vent light, the warm breath of the stove traveling up through packed clay. When she passed, it was during a melt. The creek ran high. The wind was soft. No storm announced it, only stillness. They didn't bury her. They let the chamber hold, not sealed, not filled, just kept, as if the roots themselves refused to let go of her warmth. After that the ridge changed, not suddenly, but steadily. No one stepped into Elsie's chamber without bowing their head, not out of worship but gratitude. They built a vent stone outside, flat and wide, etched not with her name, but with a question she used to ask new builders. What shape does warmth take in dirt? And beneath that, in small carving, remember, then build. That summer, children began drawing pictures in the dust outside their homes. Not of horses or soldiers or cabins with pitched roofs, but of hills, with doors, with curled smoke rising from the ground. The story had changed, and now it was theirs. Warren's Hollow, as it had once been, a town of boards and nails, of men competing over smoke and height, had faded into memory. The buildings still stood, some of them, but the ridge had eclipsed it, not by force, by function, because when the 8th winter came, the storm no one saw coming, the cold that blacked out the sun for 3 days straight, the ice that cracked stone. It wasn't the mayor's house that people fled to. It wasn't the church. It was the roots. They came in groups, in families, some dragging sleds, some carrying little more than bundled children and breathless hope. And every single one of them found space, because that summer, Hazel and Nora and Ruth and the others had been busy. Tunnels had been widened, new vents added, a tiered system of sleeping chambers carved into lower slopes. There was food enough, water drawn and stored, wool dried, salt packed, lanterns trimmed. No one asked why they'd done all that work. Because now the answer was known. Winter is never surprised. Only people are. And this time the people had learned. The snow fell for 6 days straight, then paused, then fell again. The trail markers vanished. Fence lines disappeared. And when the thaw finally came, when the sky split open and sunlight returned, they stepped outside blinking, breath misting, eyes stung with light, and the ridge still stood, still warm, still breathing. That spring, Ruth walked to Elsie's chamber and laid a flat stone beside the vent, a new one, carved with the names of every family now living in earth homes. 37. She didn't weep, she smiled, because the warmth hadn't died, it had spread. By the 8th spring, the roots were no longer just a secret in the hillside. They were a settlement in their own right. Distinct from the broken cabins that still dotted the lowlands of Warren's Hollow, distinct from the logging roads to the east, distinct even from the language of the townsfolk who once scoffed at the idea that heat could be held rather than fought for. Maps had begun to mark them, not with a town name. There was no mayor, no store, no sheriff, but with a curious little symbol, a half circle cut into a hill, a ring around it, the shorthand sign that meant Earth Homes in the ledgers of traders, scouts, and migrants moving west. A code passed quietly from one frontier to the next, a warning and an invitation. By now, those seeking passage through the region often arrived already knowing the story or part of it. A woman, a widow, laughed at, frozen winters, a cabin so strange it made the fire vanish and the cold forget its grip. Some had heard that she was a witch, others believed she was a lost daughter of natives or monks or miners. Some said she'd never existed at all, that it was only women's clever hands and dirt that held the secrets of warmth. But everyone, sooner or later, found their way to the ridge, and it was still standing, bigger now, wiser. Tunnels had grown deeper, vents more curved, moss walls reinforced with layers of crushed limestone, heated shelves beneath low sleeping hollows for babies and the elderly, seed vaults that stayed dry through 2 floods. Air was drawn in through reed bundles stuffed with wool, keeping it clean and warm even at 20 degrees below. Nora was now the one who greeted new arrivals. She no longer used a ledger, she just looked at their hands. "Show me what you've built," she'd say. And if their fingers knew the weight of stone or the softness of wet clay, she'd nod. "We'll find you a corner." Hazel had grown a garden, underground. They said it couldn't be done, but she proved them wrong with layered shelves of root vegetables, lit by sun funnels cut through glass, and fitted with mirrored stone. She could grow beets in December now, radishes in frost. And Ruth had become the pulse of the place. She led no meetings, she gave no orders, but everyone looked to her when a question came. Her daughter Lydia, now tall and wild-haired, had taken to carving tiny figurines from the old cedar stumps on the far side of the ridge. Little people, little homes. Her fingers never stopped moving, her pockets always clinking with tiny earth-colored shapes. She was a child of warmth, and no one who saw her doubted that the ridge had raised her. One day a traveling party from the north arrived, dressed in wool stitched over old Union coats, their hands blistered and their cheeks hollowed by wind. They had come from farther than most, a coal town near the mountains where the frost never left the valleys, and the men still shouted about fire as proof of worth. They stayed a week, learned, sat with Ruth and Nora and Hazel, asked to see Elsie's chamber. They left quiet. 3 months later, word came back. They'd dug their first root chamber under a cliff, sealed it with stone, and 3 families had survived a storm without losing a single log to smoke. The ridge began copying them. A new idea, a siphon vent with sloped melt channels. A few of the younger builders tried it. It worked. Now it was drawn in the walls of the memory chamber, alongside all the others, because by now, the roots had more than chambers. They had a hall, built not for worship, not for food, but for memory. Every technique was drawn there, every mistake recorded, not just on paper, in the walls, carved, pressed, marked. A cracked vent, its outline was etched on the western wall, a reminder to never build too straight across shale. A collapsed tunnel, its profile drawn above the chamber threshold, showing how clay shifts after 2 years of pressure. There were no shameful errors here, only lessons. Children were taught to trace them with their fingers, to feel the failure, to learn it before it ever happened again. That's what the roots had become, not just a place to survive, a place to remember. And then came the letter. A rider came up the trail one day in autumn, worn, coughing, eyes bleary from 3 nights on the trail. He carried only one thing, a letter from a woman across the plains. Not someone they knew, but she'd heard, and she was asking for instructions. She didn't want a handout. She wanted blueprints. She wanted to learn how to build her own home beneath the earth. She ended the letter with 4 words. I'm tired of freezing. They gathered in the memory chamber. Ruth held the letter in both hands like it might fall apart. We can't go to her, someone said. Too far. But we can write, said Nora, and so they did. A set of drawings was made, not of a perfect design, but of questions. What kind of soil do you have? What direction does your wind come from? What's your freeze depth? What can you dig with? Not because they wanted to quiz her, but because the roots didn't believe in giving heat. They believed in teaching it. When the answer came weeks later, with a hand-drawn map of her hillside and a letter 3 pages long, Ruth wept, because the warmth had reached someone who had never felt it before. And now it moved. It grew, in directions they couldn't see, in places where smoke still killed children and frost still won. The ridge had sent out more than heat. It had sent memory. The final frost came that spring. It was sudden, short, almost ceremonial. It settled on the ground one night in March, traced the ridge in thin silver lines, curled against the vent stones, and melted before sunrise. Ruth stood in Elsie's chamber that morning. She pressed her palm against the packed clay. The warmth pulsed beneath her fingers, soft, gentle, real, not magic, just right. Outside, Lydia was showing a boy how to brace a wall with woven roots. Hazel was milking the goat. Nora was carving the new chamber plan into the memory wall. And the wind? It passed over the ridge like it had somewhere else to be, not denied, just not needed. Down in the valley, a few cabins still stood. Some had been abandoned, others leaned toward collapse, but no one spoke of rebuilding them, not anymore, because warmth had moved into the hillside, and the hillside had made room. They had laughed at the widow's earth-wrapped cabin. They weren't laughing now, because warmth didn't rise. It stayed, right here, beneath their feet, forever.